Hang on. Greetings everybody and welcome. It's another live stream tonight and coming in with the specific purpose of covering the events in Palestine, but mainly focusing on a look back at the 1990s into the early 2000s and what was known as the Oslo process, and why the failure of that explains an awful lot about where we are today and why we are in this situation. More specifically, why Palestine is in this situation. Let me just drop this live link into the X sphere, as long as we're still allowed to post by Elon Musk, who of course remembered, as always, where his class interests lie, and the class interests of the American bourgeois, all of the American bourgeois, lie in the sustenance of the American empire. Even if they have tactical disagreements about this thing or that thing, the centrality of Israel and the relationship with Israel to the dominance of the American imperialist powers, or the American imperialist bloc, I should say, in the Middle East is, of course, a very important lesson to learn. And we're going to go into that a little bit. We went into it a little bit a couple of days ago when I first did this. So let me just sort this link out. Okay, so starting though with a couple of what I regard as very foolish narratives that people whose analysis in other areas I do have some respect for have been indulging in over the last 48 hours or so. And that is, of course, related to two things. One, and that is the idea that this whole attack by the Palestinian resistance forces was all some kind of scam or some kind of scheme cooked up by Benjamin Netanyahu in his desperate bid to stay in power by creating a war for himself. And this is, of course, supported by zero evidence. The only evidence that people who believe in this can cite is the fact that the Israeli army was caught literally asleep on the job, and a load of Israeli soldiers were shot dead before they could even get a uniform on. Now, the actual explanation for all of this is twofold. First of all, the Palestinian forces have had years to prepare for such an operation, to study the methods or lack of methods of the Israeli forces, to study their strengths and their weaknesses, the composition of these forces, and how they were arrayed. And of course, they've had a number of months to observe Netanyahu's moving of the most effective units in the Israeli army over into the West Bank to engage in pogroms on behalf of the most aggressive elements in the settler community. Now, this is the explanation as to why the Palestinians were able to act in such a rapid fashion. They'd planned it for many, many months, maybe even years, this kind of massive incursion. And they planned it to hit Israel when it was at its weakest, when it was distracted with a series of pogroms being carried out in the West Bank for political reasons, really, which are to do with the stability of Netanyahu's government. And also the idea that Netanyahu, this man, this criminal, who has based his entire career on the idea that only he can keep Israel safe, the idea that he would want to oversee a very public humiliation of the Israeli army in this way, with quite a number of Israeli senior commanders killed. Many of their special forces units were literally decapitated because their senior officers were either killed or captured. The images of Israeli tanks burning, including the latest, the Mckay 5, and hundreds of prisoners of war being herded back into the Gaza Strip to be now threatened with execution live on television. All of that is fatal to Netanyahu's reputation. So the idea that he cooked this up, I think, is frankly ludicrous. And the other aspect of this, there is a political aspect of this, which is that many people, including those who purport to hate American imperialism and Israel, they cannot conceive still of American imperialism and Israel being defeated by what they still regard as an inferior force. They do not believe, and I don't blame anybody for thinking this way, it's hard to think that the unless you're actually educated in history and know how to analyze that history, unless you do have that knowledge and that ability to analyze it, you're going to fall for the advertising that America, the American empire and its various satellites, including Israel, is immortal, that it never loses, that it's always extending its control over everything. And this sort of breeds a type of, I've mentioned this before, inverted American exceptionalism. The belief that the US is just simply too powerful, that it can only ever be defeated by an equal force or by its own mistakes. The idea that the movement of the masses, particularly the most oppressed people in the world, can defeat the imperial hegemon and its puppet state in the form of Israel. This is something that many people, including those who say that they hate the US empire and all its works, they cannot accept it. They refuse to learn the lessons from what happened in the Korean War, for instance, where the technologically superior US forces were actually defeated with the assistance of course, many people from the pouring over the border from the Chinese Red Army. And of course, then you get the example of the French in Algeria, defeated by a guerrilla campaign. You get the example of the Americans themselves in Vietnam, defeated again by the Vietnamese. And of course, that was followed by the complaint of General Westmoreland that if we could have just taken the gloves off, we could have won. But what is the point that we can ascertain through all of these wars, including the more recent wars where they lost to the Taliban in Afghanistan? They lost to the Taliban. Remember that. Now, I know that there will be people who will say, well, we didn't militarily lose. But yes, you lost the war, because a war, yes, it consists of a lot of battlefield operations, but it also exists in the economic and the political sphere as well. And in the end, none of those were sustainable for the United States. The United States, for all its imperial grandioseness and all its pretensions of global hegemony, is a constrained power. Partly because, of course, capitalism anywhere is always constrained in what it can do. That it is always constrained, as is any system, based on the rule of a tiny minority who control the means of production in a society, exercising their dictatorship over the great masses of the people. Any ruling class is always constrained in what it can do. It can, of course, create a lot of misery for the masses. It can create a lot of chaos, but it always is more constrained than you would like to think. What a lot of people can't accept about US imperialism is that it has all these weaknesses. For instance, they would have loved to have instituted conscription 20 years ago and sent a conscripted army to occupy Iraq, to completely destroy all the resistance there if they could, but they couldn't. The long-lasting effects of Vietnam are still with them. The opposition to conscription in the US would be very, very high, and it would destabilize the bourgeois dictatorship if they tried to put that in place, even after 9/11. So this is what's true of the US is even more true of its puppets. It's true of Israel too. They are constrained in what they can do. They might not appear to be, but one of the reasons why I think that the Palestinians attacked in the way that they did was that they were trying to leverage open the contradictions inside Israeli society by luring the Israeli army into a massive assault, ground assault on Gaza, and being able to inflict huge casualties on the Israeli armed forces. And that is clearly what they are planning to do. And it's what the many Palestinian strategists, not just in Hamas, but in other groups in the resistance as well, have written about over and over again. And this is what is going on there. So I reject these ideas completely, that this is all part of some genius scheme of Netanyahu's. I know somebody in the comments, Banana Bender, has said an Egyptian official told Israel 10 days beforehand that something was going to happen. Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. We don't know that. Perhaps the Egyptians passed on something, but Netanyahu is an arrogant, foolish, and complacent man. he probably thought, if he was told anything at all, that it would be some kind of missile launch that they could easily deal with. There's no way that the Israeli political establishment would want to be revealed to be this much of a paper tiger by this massive attack. There's no way that they'd have wanted loads of prisoners to be taken. And they can't, and they will not want to launch a ground assault in Gaza, because all of the military commanders will be telling Netanyahu, if you do that, we will lose hundreds, maybe even thousands of men. But that's what the resistance movements in Gaza have decided, that they want to lure the Israelis into this ground war. They want to see them try and take all of the Gaza Strip. And that will be a brutal and bloody operation. And the Israelis will lose many, many men. The Palestinians will lose many, many more. There will be multiple thousands dead. There always is going to be, there always are going to be multiple thousands dead. Whenever the Palestinians fire off one rocket against Israel, Israel responds to the tune of a ratio of about 100 or 1,000 to 1. Bear in mind, though, that the last time Israel tried a ground assault in the Gaza Strip in 2014, they got less than a third of the way in. They started losing a lot of men. They declared victory and ran out again, because the military commanders know that it's a suicide run, and it would create severe problems in Israeli society if they were going to do that. As also been pointed out in the comments by Lachlan, that the Southern IDF outposts are manned by conscripts who are apparently very poorly trained. Another point was raised by a British journalist who had some contact with the Hezbollah commander, says that in 2006, Hezbollah found that the regular Israeli infantry were very, very poor, poorly trained, poorly organized, and poorly motivated. Israel does, of course, have some effective special forces units, but the main line infantry for the Israeli army is, by accounts of not just Palestinian or Lebanese sources, but by accounts of Israeli senior officers and former senior officers, the mainline Israeli infantry isn't very good. What they're good at is brutalizing civilians and shooting unarmed Palestinians. That's what they're good at. They're not good at having to face a determined, even lightly armed force. And now it's been revealed that they're no good. So you're telling me, the conspiracy theorists on this out there, that Netanyahu is that much of a stupid arsehole, because he's not stupid, by the way. He's arrogant and he's foolish, but he's not stupid, that he would risk the Israeli army being revealed to be a bunch of ill-trained buffoons who got overrun in a few hours by the Palestinians? Also what? Also he could do to Gaza that which he could have done anyway? This doesn't work. This explanation is foolish. And I would go a little bit further and say that if you read the accounts from inside what's been going on in Gaza for many, many years, because this has been coming for years. This has been coming since 2006 at least. Remember what I said on the previous stream, where we were talking about how the Israelis, with the collaboration of the US, of course, and the British imperialists, managed to seal off Gaza, to turn it into a giant prison camp of 2 million people, many of whom are very, very young. Now, they did that after the elections in 2006, which, of course, saw Hamas emerge as the leading party. After that, the Israelis got their puppet regime, which is what the PLA has become. It's a puppet regime, essentially to cut off relations with Hamas and essentially try and start a civil war to take over the Gaza Strip. The PLA lost that war, and they were evicted from the Gaza Strip. After that, the various factions inside Gaza, many of whom had been rivals and had even fought each other at various points, started a long and complex process of negotiation. And you can find some of these documents online. I've posted some of them on the Telegram group, where like the Hamas, even Fatah for a while, but Hamas certainly, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who are a Marxist-Leninist group, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, another Marxist-Leninist group, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, they began the long and tortuous process of forming a unified resistance command. Initially, they wanted to include Fatah, the armed wing or the principal armed element within the old Palestine Liberation Organization. But, of course, Abbas just became a puppet of US imperialism, and so that was not possible. But within Gaza, all of these groups, from the religious nationalists in Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, through to the Marxist-Leninists and everything in between, have slowly formed a unified national united front operation against the Israelis. So the operations that they started to conduct when they unified their commands and were acting as one became increasingly sophisticated. Now, it's said by many that, oh, well, they get all their weapons from Iran, it's all smuggled in, they don't produce anything. This is also untrue. Brian Berletic, in his latest video, made a completely unsupported assertion, which is unusual for him because he's usually very well evidenced in his videos, that all the weapons were being brought in from Iran. This is untrue. We've seen a certain amount of evidence that you can manufacture. We've seen some of the videos come out of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip repurposing Israeli rockets and turning them, the explosive elements and various other bits of the circuit board into domestically produced rockets that can be used to, at the very least, confuse the anti-missile system of the Iron Dome. So they've had many years, the Palestinians in Gaza, to organize a joint resistance, to work out their strategies, to test what the Israelis can do and what they can't do, and to assess what's the best way of securing their objective, which is to actually get the Israeli army to try and fight inside Gaza itself. And this is clearly what is being worked towards here. So the other point I wanted to make is about Hamas, and this is a conspiracy theory is floating around amongst various people, including Berletic has said this, various other characters have said, well, Hamas are controlled opposition. They don't really want to liberate Palestine. They're all part of Benjamin Netanyahu's big plan. Now, they've cited in evidence of this a couple of things. One is comments made by Netanyahu that Hamas are his best friend. We should fund Hamas to keep ourselves going. Look, Netanyahu may well have said that, but again, that makes him arrogant and rather foolish. It doesn't prove that this is all some sort of controlled opposition campaign. The other point that Berletic made in his video was that Hamas have some lineage back to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood was backed by the British for a while. Now, let's deal with this. The Muslim Brotherhood was backed to a certain degree by the British and the Americans to try and make trouble for Nasser. That much is true. Hamas in the later 1980s emerged as a rival to the largely secular forces under the umbrella of the PLO. Now, they did this because of internal contradictions within Gaza and the West Bank themselves, because the PLO, in particular the PFLP, DFLP, but also Fatah, have been heavily influenced by more secular nationalist and socialist ideologies that were ultimately given a huge boost in the Arab world via the Bolshevik Revolution and the existence of the Soviet Union. When that all starts to fade, and particularly after the earthquake that was the Iranian Revolution and the coming to power of the Khomeinists, religious nationalist organizations received a giant boost, along with, of course, they inherited the mantle of the most militant fighters, because from 87 to 88 onwards, Arafat and the PLO leaders started the process of negotiations with Israel. This intensifies after 1990. And the Bush administration believing that they could force a settlement in the in occupied Palestine. So Hamas, in the middle 80s, I mean, Arafat accused them of being a creation of the Americans. They weren't. They were a domestic production. They came out of the contradictions in Palestinian society that existed between a movement that was largely secular and socialist, or socialistic, shall we say, and which had a lot of Palestinian Christians within it, and the more conservative elements in those societies, that generally they came from the poorer end of the Palestinian population, who were more drawn increasingly in the 1980s towards forms of conservative religious nationalism, which is what Hamas were putting forward. Now, was it the case that the Israelis and the Americans were prepared to play on that contradiction between the PLO and Hamas to try and promote one at the expense of the other? Of course it was. The reason why the British backed the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in the 1950s was because they saw it as a way of inconveniencing Nasser. Didn't mean they wanted the Muslim Brotherhood to rule Egypt, as we'll come to later. But the idea that because the Israelis tried to boost Hamas at the expense of the PLO, and that's why Hamas exists, this is a stupid idea. And it's another case of people not paying any attention or bothering to do any research about the developments inside Palestinian resistance movements and how it was the case that Hamas became the leading force, at least inside Gaza. And that is all to do with what we're talking about tonight. That is all to do with the 1990s and a so-called Oslo process. That's how Hamas came to be what they are today. They're not a controlled opposition. I mean, this is a ridiculous idea that I've seen a lot of Americans engage in this. Like, you want a controlled opposition, look at Mahmoud Abbas. He's a controlled opposition. He's directly employed by US imperialism to police Palestinian resistance movements. That's an example of a controlled opposition. I mean, for a lot of these people, and I don't know what Berletich's motivations for saying this are. I won't comment on what he's rather secretive about what his actual politics are. I have some suspicions that he might be some sort of American libertarian, but I'm not going to speculate further on that. But the point is that even organizations that are indulged by the imperialists at some point can evolve into something else over time. Like another example, and I wonder whether Brian Berletich would make the same claim of a figure like Viktor Orban, who he appears to approve of. Viktor Orban, in the 1980s, was funded by the Open Society Foundation. He was funded by George Soros. They were working together against the communists at the time, and continued to have some kind of positive relationship into the 1990s. Orban and Soros later had a major falling out. So would Brian and others of his belief system or beliefs say that Viktor Orban is an example of controlled opposition? I don't think that he would. I think that, particularly for Americans, what they're doing by saying, oh, Israel is behind Hamas, it's all a controlled operation, they're trying to avoid having to express any support for Hamas because they are still within the paradigm of this whole war on terror ideology that was put out there by the Bush administration, Blair and others in the late 90s, a little bit, but particularly after 2001. This is all basically to make any association with Hamas or anything else akin to supporting Al-Qaeda. This was a deliberate program engaged in by the Israelis. Remember, Ariel Sharon, the late and unlamented Ariel Sharon, said that Yasser Arafat is our bin Laden. You couldn't get two figures further away from each other. And so what these people are doing by saying, oh, Israel created Hamas, first of all, they're making shit up. They're indulging in a fantasy version of history. They're trying to avoid displaying any support for or sympathy for Hamas as they would see it. They're trying to, as they would see it, keep their hands clean. And fundamentally, it's an ill-informed and rather pathetic analysis that doesn't take into account how organizations change and evolve, how societies change and evolve. Because a lot of the people who quite sincerely hate US imperialism still don't understand it very well. They don't. They look at all the symptoms, but they can't analyze the totality. Only Marxists can actually analyze the totality. It's not an arrogant claim, it's just true. Now, the whole question oh yeah, somebody's put it in the question, but that Hamas was involved in trying to overthrow Assad. They weren't involved in it. They expressed support early on for the revolt against Assad, which was a tremendous political mistake. And they later retracted that support and had meetings with Assad to declare their solidarity with him. They also had meetings with the Iranian leadership. So, again, Hamas is an organization with many links to various different conservative and reactionary forces in the Gulf, but essentially the role that it's playing in Gaza now is in the leadership role of a national resistance movement. And so whenever I hear it's Israel versus Hamas, this is also untrue. Hamas is, of course, the predominant force. It plays a very important role, but it's in an alliance with a myriad of other groups. It's also they are the people who actually won the elections inside Gaza and actually came first inside the Palestinian elections 17 years ago. So the Palestinian population came over to their side as well. So is the argument of Berletich and others that the Palestinians have all been hoodwinked into supporting an American operation? This doesn't make any sense. It's profoundly insulting to the intelligence of the masses involved, to be blunt about it. This kind of nonsense that they're talking. Now, to move back to the question of the evolution of Hamas, let's now go back and revisit the 1990s, which is very popular in revivals at the moment. But to understand the evolution of Hamas and the decline of Fatah, you have to go back to the 1990s. Now, for many years, the American imperialists were demanding that if the PLO would recognize Israel's right to exist, then negotiations could be had and a settlement could be reached. And in the later 1980s, Arafat did just that. And therefore, the Bush senior administration started a process that became known as the Oslo process. Now, this went on for the entirety of the 90s into the early 2000s. And it was trumpeted as the great peace in our time moment, funnily enough. And it's got the famous image of Yitzhak Rabin, who was later to be assassinated in a move that Netanyahu played some kind of supportive role in, shall we say. It was him shaking hands with Arafat on the lawn of the White House, Billy Boy Clinton beaming away in the background, probably thinking of the party he was going to go to with Ehud Barak later on at Jeffrey Epstein's place. But what happened is, of course, that the conventional narrative, which I will outline to you first, is that in the 1990s, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres made this amazing offer to Arafat, and later on Ehud Barak made an even better offer to Arafat, and Arafat, being arrogant and ignorant and stubborn, refused this generous offer, and this led to the collapse of the peace process and, the rise of Sharon and Netanyahu, and everything imploded from there on in. It was all thanks to Arafat refusing a generous offer. Now, we have to properly understand why the Oslo process failed. What was actually on offer through the Oslo process to the Palestinians? What was Ehud Barak's generous offer made in the year 2000 that Arafat is so pilloried for turning down? So what was going on throughout the 1990s when the PLO, having recognized Israel, having made that enormous concession to recognize the legitimacy of a state that they had until then correctly stated was illegitimate? Now, the question of that is like, well, what were they offered in return? The answer is not a lot. So the generous offer of Barak in the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, was in effect for a series of disconnected areas in the West Bank and Gaza that wouldn't be linked up by land, that would be essentially surrounded and totally controlled by Israel, that would have no real sovereignty in any real sense. There would be it wouldn't be a contiguous state. There would be no ability of the Palestinians to move through Israel unchecked. Israel would control everything that went in and everything that went out. So this was basically a series of dots on a map that would be separated by vast areas of Israel. And that was the generous offer. There would be no right of return for most of the refugees who have been living in camps in Lebanon and inside the West Bank and in Egypt for many, many decades. That was the extent of the so-called generous offer, as a micro-state that would be completely controlled by the Israelis, and that was it. It would have no sovereignty, no territorial integrity, no ability to really defend itself. And in return, the Palestinians had to give up almost everything. Basically reservations, says DE. Well, they called it Bantustans. It was one of the plans of the old apartheid regime to have like a series of black-only areas surrounded by white areas. Now, all the way through the 1990s, there was all this talk, I mean, in liberal circles, that there was a peace process. But what was actually happening on the ground, and this goes back to why Hamas becomes more popular as time goes on amongst particularly the most poverty-stricken and deprived elements in Gaza and the West Bank. It is because that all the time that Rabin was talking peace, what happened on the ground? The Israeli settlement process did not stop at any point. At no point did Clinton put a metaphorical gun to the Israelis' head and say, you have to stop the settlement process. He talked a bit about it, that there shouldn't be more settlements. Well, maybe there shouldn't be some more. Hillary called Jeffrey, or anything like that. He let it continue. And so what Arafat and the PLO leaders were being asked to sign up to was a series of never-ending boundary changes that were running all the way up to 2000, whereby the Israelis were, under the settlement program, were seizing more land every single year, were evicting more Palestinians every single year. And all that time, from about 1990 all the way through to 2000, what is Arafat and the PLO leaders doing? Well, they're bargaining with an Israeli leadership which is completely fucking over the Palestinian population on the ground and continually evicting them from their homes. And so when you see that, if you're a Palestinian and you can't leave, you can't go anywhere, you are under siege, you've been under siege all your life, you are now you're faced with your great former hero, your nationalist leader, up there with Yitzhak Rabin grinning away and shaking hands on the White House lawn with Bill Clinton. Yet at the same, you're being told you're in a peace process, but what you're actually facing is dispossession, continual dispossession by an aggressively expansionist Israeli state, fully backed up by the American imperialists, by the way, no matter what old Billy said. And so is it any wonder that Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other rejectionist forces, others who rejected the so-called peace process, PFLP and the DFLP went back and forth on it. Initially, they rejected it. I think Arafat brought a lot of pressure to bear on them, and eventually the Americans made some concessions. I think they took the DFLP off the terror list for a while, and they joined the negotiating team. But then they rejected what came out of it. But when you've got Palestinian Islamic Jihad and particularly Hamas standing outside of that process and continuing to bomb Israel, remember the suicide bombing wave of the late 90s and early 2000s, well, what you see is that the process, the peace process, was a fraud and a lie. And this is a big reason, it's probably the biggest reason, why the Palestinian masses started to swing behind Hamas as an organization. Because when Hamas stood up and said, this is a fraud, the PLO leadership is selling you out, you are continuing to lose your land, you are continuing to be pushed out, and yet this clown, Arafat, is on TV saying, we're in a peace process. Why on earth wouldn't Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad pick up more support if the gap between the PLO leaders' rhetoric and the actual living reality of the Palestinian masses on the ground was so far apart? Well, it's no wonder that the PLO or Fatah's leadership came into question. Arafat remained a popular figure, but his authority was severely damaged by that. That's why it all failed, and that's why Arafat, in the end, had to reject Ehud Barak's so-called generous offer, because it was a shit offer that was based on essentially a confirmation of all the land that Israel had stolen in the previous decade when he'd been supposedly negotiating with them. And then, of course, Arafat lost control of the situation because the masses revolted, and you got the Second Intifada after Sharon did his provocative walk up on at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so what you have to go back to is the fact that the peace process was a fraud. It was always a fraud. The Oslo Accords were a joke because the Israelis never stopped expansion. And here then we get to the nub of the issue, so to speak, the root of the issue. It is because, of course, the nature of the Israeli state cannot stop aggressive expansionism. The way it is set up is that it has to constantly expand. It has to constantly find new territory to conquer. It has to settle more settlers in new areas. Its source of authority now isn't based on the original setup of Israel in 1948 even. It's based on continually acquiring more land and expanding. If it stops doing that, then it ceases to be a Zionist state. He ceases to be a Jewish supremacist state. Because if they are no longer able to expand, if they're no longer able to bring in more and more settlers to try and outnumber the Palestinians, because the other big fear of the Israelis is that they're just going to end up outnumbered by the Arab population and ended up getting swallowed, which is why they have to do all these pogroms, all these mass expulsions, why they would love to do the kind of mass expulsions that earlier regimes could have gotten away with, but now they can't because they are constrained in what they can do. And so, again, this goes back to the fact that the Oslo process was a fraud. Even if Rabin had wanted to stop settlement expansion, if he'd have done so, they'd have killed him even quicker. Because you would bring into question the entire nature and the entire stability of the Israeli state. If it's not an expansionist, Jewish supremacist, Zionist state, a settler colonial state, then it's nothing. It can't just go to being some sort of regular, normal, so-called normalized Zionist enterprise in the Middle East. It would implode. Its internal contradictions would blow up. It would be consumed by them. And so it can't stop, which is why the two-state solution isn't something that is ever going to be a serious consideration. Now, you might ask why countries such as Russia and China put it forward. Well, they've got many reasons for doing so. But they've got to be aware, at least on some level, because the people who run the foreign ministries in Russia and China aren't stupid. They've got to be aware that if they did seriously try and enforce a two-state solution, that it would be the end of Israel. The Israeli state, if it was made to stop being an aggressively expansionist state, withdraw from the territory conquered in the 1967 war and agree to a Palestinian state with real sovereignty, that would be fatal. Any Israeli government which signed that deal would be gone in 24 hours, probably. Israel would collapse into an internal contradiction, possibly involving up to a civil war. It would explode. And so, again, this is why no Israeli government is going to agree to a two-state solution unless they have literally no other choice. Unless support from the United States is cut off, unless they are faced with a military defeat that they cannot get around because they can't use nuclear weapons inside the territory of Israel itself. It's only in the case of military defeat or being externally cut off from the United States and its myriad of aid packages that it gives Israel that the Israeli government any Israeli government would be forced to sign some sort of two-state solution. And even if they did it then, it would lead to the rapid collapse of whatever was left of Israel shortly afterwards. Israel is either this maximalist state or it is nothing. And to a certain extent, this makes Netanyahu the ideal man to lead it. Right, a lot of questions, a lot of comments, so I'm going to troll through some of those before going further. Right, so hello to various comrades in the chat. Jason, Klavek, Terry, Lachlan, hello. Right, good evening to Roddy, good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. So, Philbin says, The widespread, careful, and defensive nature of the Palestinian military operation is indicative of a population that is mobilized to liberate itself. Yeah, I mean, you couldn't do an operation like this and take the risks that the Palestinian resistance have taken unless you have a solid mass of the Palestinian population in Gaza behind you and essentially ready to fight. You have a huge number of the populace ready to go, basically, and are behind this tactic. So this is carefully considered and has been planned for possibly years in terms of its scope and its scale. It certainly shows that it's been planned for years. Eventually, the Israelis will mobilize enough decent troops, I think, to push the Palestinian forces out of the territories they've temporarily run into. But that's probably planned for as well. They plan to fall back to the Gaza Strip, and they plan to make the Israelis fight them on the ground, the one thing that the Israelis absolutely do not want to do. So yes, it's carefully planned, and clearly the masses are mobilized behind this. Hello to Red Star Betty, President Jesus. Good evening to Michael. And Lachlan says, seems like the Gazans are better prepared than the West Bank because they have some level of secrecy and organization. Yeah, I mean, Scott Ritter wrote an interesting article about the failures in Israeli intelligence and how, yes, they are able to intercept every single text message, email, instant message, whatever you send electronically in Gaza, they can intercept. But because they pull in so much information, they need essentially an AI program to analyze it all and look for patterns. And if you know that that's what the Israelis are looking for, or know what the patterns are, then you can avoid it. You can build counters into your planning, which is clearly what they've been doing. I mean, another thing I object to about these like conspiracy theory guys is like they never give the oppressed people of the world any credit. The only people they ever want to give any credit to are the Americans, the Israelis, and the Europeans. Even those who purport to hate them can't imagine that the masses in Palestine or anywhere else are capable of outwitting the great and all-powerful Westerners. Maybe it's not intentional racialism, but it's certainly unintentional. That's the practical effect anyway. Philbin says, hints of increased military expertise of Palestinians compared to relative hacks in IDF's clusterfuck in prior battle for Jenin in July. Israeli soldiers bumbled around and had to withdraw. Yeah, they lost a big battle in the Jenin refugee camp. Bear in mind, the Palestinian fighters have been training to fight Israeli forces their entire lives. They've got generation after generation of experience of fighting the Israelis. They know the Israelis very, very well in terms of what they can do and what they can't do. The Israelis mirror all the weaknesses of the US, which is that they can level places, they can bomb places to bits, but in reality, a lot of their army can't fight. A lot of their army isn't very capable of. They've got some capable special forces operators, but they're, again, as I said, it was analysed by, I think it was Martin J on Twitter, a British journalist based in Morocco, that Hezbollah fighters who talked to him observed that the Israeli infantry just couldn't fight. It was nowhere near as good as what the Hezbollah fighters had been capable of performing to, the level they could perform to. So, yeah, the Israelis, and the Israeli army, I think, it has to be said, is wildly overrated because it's based essentially on what? Their military supremacy and their mythology is based on principally a lightning attacks against ill-prepared and, quite frankly, slightly useless opponents in the 1967 war, poorly led and poorly organized armies, essentially. For all that Nasser was an anti-colonial hero, the performance of the Egyptian armed forces was never particularly great during his time in office. And the Israelis did organize themselves well then, and they performed pretty well in the 1956 war. And of course, they get the famous victory in the Nakba in 1948. But bear in mind, 1948, the Israelis have a solid core of World War II veterans organizing that early army of theirs up against the chaotic and disorganized forces of the Arab monarchies who didn't want to fight anyway. And again, like that solid core of World War II veterans in the command sphere saw them through into the 1960s. People like Moshe Dayan, for instance, who was a World War II veteran, and many others who came up during that period were very militarily experienced. After the Yom Kippur War and into the 80s and 90s, Israel actually stops fighting external wars and focuses on, brutalization of the civilian population. That's what the Israeli army's been doing really since they were forced out of southern Lebanon by Hezbollah. So is it really a surprise that an army that's not fought a serious external opponent in at least 20 years, and then when they did, briefly in 2006, they lost that war against an opponent who had already driven them out of southern Lebanon several years earlier. And they haven't fought a serious external war since the early 1970s. I mean, they did invade Lebanon, but again, most of that was involved them fighting in a guerrilla style. So, again, is it a surprise that they're 2 generations away from having commanders with serious experience? The Israeli society is also degenerated a long way. A lot of the conscripts don't want to serve in the Israeli army. Again, this is why when the Iranian leadership says that Israel is finished, maybe they're right. For all that they can level buildings, kill large numbers of people, they still aren't able to triumph over the Palestinian resistance, because to do so would involve engaging in a major war, which up to this point, Israelis have been very unwilling to do. So, where are we at the moment? Okay, Banana Bender says, Blumenthal posted on Twitter about making weapons from bombs dropped on them by Israel. Yeah, that's what I was referring to earlier. The Palestinians have got their own workshops buried deep underground. They don't need to bring in things from Iran. I'm sure the Iranians are supplying something, but a lot of what they produce is domestically manufactured. They supposedly get weapons from Qatar, says Lachlan. Apparently Hamas had some kind of relationship with the Qataris. The Qataris always play us like a deceptive double game on this. So who knows? I suspect that they fund some factions in Gaza a little bit, basically. But they are also playing the other side of the fence in that they're also allies of the imperialists from time to time. So the Qataris are a bit of a funny one. You never know which way they're going to jump. Largely, it's always in their own interest, though. Philbin says, are you surprised by Abbas's response? If he matters, that is. The PA says Palestinians have the right to self-defense. Well, he has to say that. He can't come out and denounce it, because that would be the end of his authority. But don't look at what he says. Look at what his security forces do. If you look at Resistance News Network on Telegram, they're always chronicling how the Palestinian Authority security forces routinely arrest members of other armed groups on behalf of Israel and continue to do so. So whatever the hell Abbas says, what his security apparatus does is very telling. And his security apparatus works for the Israelis and ultimately works for US imperialism. But he has to come out and say that, and his ambassadors have to go on TV and defend the rights of the Palestinians to armed resistance, because if they don't do that, then they're politically finished. If they go out and say and denounce it, or make the kind of ludicrous statements that some of the communists around the world have made, then they'd be cooked, they'd be done. Okay, Philbin quotes directly from Abbas, who apparently has said, strengthen the steadfastness of the Palestinians in the face of the crimes committed by the Israeli occupation and settler gangs. Yes, it's surprising that he's come out and said that, but bear in mind also what I just said. Unless he says things like that, politically he's done. And so is Fatah. So he has to come out and back it. Now, let's look at what he does, not what he says. And if what he does is continue to arrest Palestinians on behalf of Israel, then we can see clearly what side that he's on. Hello to Kay. Good evening to Morgan. And okay. And Richard Cooper says, yeah, the Berletich claim about Hamas being involved in trying to overthrow Assad. Yeah, I've already talked about that. It was a mistake of Hamas, which they later recanted upon. Right. Whoa, where are we? Okay. Left in Israel are becoming more vocal, it appears. Well, let's see. They haven't been vocal for a long time. I think it's extremely repressive and an extremely reactionary atmosphere in Israel. Good evening to Peter from Perfidious Albion, my fellow resident of this most perfidious island, the island that, of course, gave rise to Israel. Good evening to Zuleika. And Peter says, the Duran guys seem to be speculating that a massive conflict in Israel gives the Biden regime an unexpected, blood-drenched but welcome off-ramp from the doomed Ukraine debacle. Any thoughts? Yeah, that's not thinking that I share in the slightest. Bear in mind that just a couple of months ago, Jake Sullivan, the idiot of a national security advisor for Biden, was babbling on about how they'd had this great triumph in the Middle East because it'd never been so quiet. So, you know what, they planned to make themselves look even more foolish. They planned to do what exactly? Cause a war in the Middle East so they could get out of a war in Ukraine? And by the way, if they get out of the war in Ukraine is lost, which it will be anyway, by the way, and they'll still have suffered an enormous defeat and political humiliation. So what? Crazy old Joe Biden came up with that? No, doubtful. Jake Sullivan came up with that? Even more doubtful. They want to find a way out, but they don't want to find a way out that involves like the Russian flag flying over Kiev and the Russians getting all of their aims met. Now, will some in the US jump on this as a chance to do what they're more comfortable with, which is screaming for the deaths en masse of Arabs? Well, yes, they will. But the idea that the Biden administration cooked this up, again, like, I respect a lot of the work that those guys do, but I have profound disagreements with them on the political level. They're basically two liberal guys who are honest about their beliefs, so I have no issue with that. But the fact is that this wasn't some kind of genius scheme of the Biden regime. This was an event that was long in the planning, that was ignored by the Israelis because they either didn't pick up on it or they dismissed the warnings that did come because they thought it'd just be another missile strike and they could deal with that. Drop another few bombs on Gaza, go back to doing what you need to do if you're Netanyahu, which is pogroms in the West Bank. That was his political priority. The full annexation of the West Bank and the mass expulsion of the population. That was his big thing. Now that's going to be much, much more difficult. So it also derails, to a certain extent, the plans that Netanyahu had. He now has to divert forces, stretch things. If things kick off in southern Lebanon, also, it's further chaos invited there. So this stretches the Israelis in potentially 3 different directions. Now, what? The Biden regime wanted that? Netanyahu wanted that? No. The thing is about, look, there's many different times in history when all kinds of conspiracies have been cooked up by ruling cliques, particularly in desperate situations. So I never rule out some kind of crazy idea coming up, but you have to analyze this seriously and think, well, no matter how irrational and stupid you think these people are, they're still running the most powerful imperialist state in the world. And so they still have to go through a bureaucratic process to get these ideas through. They still have to a certain extent, debate them within their own circles. And the idea of southern Israel being overrun by Palestinian armed forces, that's not an idea that would be particularly appealing inside the very pro-Israel circles inside Washington. So I just do not buy this idea at all. Capitalizing on it, no, I don't agree with that either. I think that the Biden, if he wanted anything, wanted to try and wind down foreign engagement as far as, well, this isn't Biden making this decision. The lizards that control the Democratic Party, shall we say, Hillary Clinton maybe, the Council of Elders, would have wanted to try and find a way to relegate Ukraine to mid-centerfold news, maybe, or back page news, stick it in the sports section, to turn the attention more towards the domestic, because they don't win elections on foreign policy in the United States. I don't think so, not really. You could argue that Bush tried to make an exception to that in 2004, but I would argue that it was much more on domestic issues and much more to do with the sheer uselessness of the Democratic Party and possibly some rigging from the Republicans as well. So they would want to turn away from foreign policy issues. You're not going to win an election, by the way, banging on about Israel. Yes, you can mobilize the evangelical vote. Yes, you can, but you know the Republicans have got that sewn up anyway. There's not a lot of votes for Biden and the Democrats in banging on about Israel for the next year and spending money on it. There might have been votes in it 30 years ago, but there's not now. All of those votes have gone to the Republican Party. If your priority is Israel, you're voting for any Republican candidate. Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Nikki foaming at the mouth Haley, all have the same policy, which is, blow up Gaza, kill them all, essentially, the fascist solution. Biden's probably got that policy as well. He's just a little more quiet about it. So, yeah, they would have wanted to turn away to focus on domestic issues as far as they could. And they wouldn't have wanted this like massive headache that they've now got. But now that they've got it, are they going to try and exploit it? Well, maybe, but it's a very difficult thing for them to exploit. What are they going to do? They're going to start running aircraft off the USS Gerald Ford and start bombing Gaza themselves? I doubt that. Because if they do that, then they've got another escalation. The Iraqi resistance movements are already saying if you do that, we'll attack all your bases in Iraq. Then they'll find that their position in Syria becomes destabilized. Like, this is what I mean about constraints. Whatever move that even the madder elements in the US want to make, they find themselves facing more constraints. Again, let's go back all the way to the Russian special military operation. If they really were unafraid of the Russian response, if they really did think that the Russian military was completely incapable and couldn't fight and would be scared off by the presence of the United States, if they really thought that, then they would have done what Scott Ritter suggested when he came on our podcast over 18 months ago, and they would have stuck, the 81st Airborne or the 101st Airborne into Kiev as a show of strength. They didn't do that because they know on some level that the Russian military is, and much more today, but even back then, 18 months ago, it was the case that this was a formidable force that could easily match anything the US had. It's why they didn't do it. It's why they're letting the Ukrainians die cheaply, as the Dutch defense minister says. They have a significant number of constraints upon them, not the least of which is, of course, also the domestic consideration. Can you institute a mass mobilization of the US population now to go and fight in Ukraine? No, probably not. To go and die for the purposes of strengthening Israel? Also probably not. The US imperialists are constrained. And a lot of the time, many people don't seem to be wanting to see that or be able to see it. Right. Okay, so right, where are we now? Yuan says, democracy was promoted in the Arab Gulf by British to counterbalance Nasser. Kuwait, Bahrain agreed. Saudis did not. Well, I mean, the British counterbalance to Nasser was always the relationship with Saudi Arabia, I believe, and also the Gulf states, which are by no means in any way democratic. So can you clarify what you actually mean there? Hello to Munis. J. Londonono says, the escalatory spiral on the northern border along Lebanon with Hezbollah seems inescapable at this point. US carriers off the coast and neocon elements bleating for war in Iran. What is the end goal? Perhaps there isn't one. Consider that. Perhaps the US does not have some kind of great big genius plan, but is in fact a weakened imperialist state, staggering from one crisis to another, desperately reacting, trying to hold down its position all over the world, and losing ground everywhere. I don't think they have a great ingenious plan. Their great ingenious plan in Ukraine has gone down in flames. So I think that now this is the decaying hegemon trying to hold on to its various different positions, and eventually it will lose all of them. Not saying it won't be brutal, not saying it won't be costly, not saying that there won't be ups and downs, but the downward trajectory is set. So Philbin says a lot of the conspiracists around the government in Gaza come from the bad blood. Was the overthrow of Fatah in Gaza June '07? It was bloody. If you understand, PLO, IDF were planning attacks and were preempted. Yeah, the PLO or the Fatah spy chief was trained by the CIA. They did launch an attack, and Hamas got the better of them. Hamas preempted it, and it was the CIA and the MI6 were working directly with the forces of the PLO of Fatah to try and destroy Hamas. Does that look like a controlled opposition to you? Come on, think for a moment about the origins of this thing, about the origins of the isolation of Gaza. What are we really saying? Making a serious point that the guys that run Hamas just like this situation continuing because they love lording it up in Gaza? Seriously? I mean, those guys can go and have lived a fairly comfortable retirement in Qatar if that's what they were after. If they were after money and lording it over a Palestinian statelet, then they could have done a deal with Abbas many years ago to become the joint policemen of a truncated Bantustan semi-statelet that the Israelis would give them. The way to money and the way to riches is not to resist the Israelis and to resist the demands of US imperialism. The way to money and riches and personal financial security is to agree with them, is to work with Abbas and to form this joint prison for the Palestinians. That's the way where the money is. It's not sitting in Gaza under siege for the last 17 years and being bombed almost every week. But the people who put this forward aren't using their brains, seriously. And also, like, the influence of the Palestinian masses on the situation is always ignored by these people. The changes in Hamas have come about because of the influence of the Palestinian and the wider Arab masses upon them. They've been compelled to change from what they would have been originally in the 1980s. It's a different organization now. It's now compelled to collaborate with Syria and Iran, something that they wouldn't have wanted to do in the 1980s. But through the struggles of the Palestinian people, their own organizations have been forced to change along with them. Nothing is unchanging. Everything is in motion, economically, politically, on a societal level. Everything is in a process of constant change, constant interaction. And that every process does, even processes that end in failure, produce some form of change which lasts into the next form of the struggle. Remember what I was talking about the other day when the words of Mao, when he was talking about how organizations rise up, are found inadequate, they're either cast aside or they fundamentally change and become something slightly different. And then in the next round of struggle, that iteration of an organization is found to be inadequate and it is cast aside by the masses and a new organization rises up. This is the process of political evolution and revolution ultimately. Nothing stays the same. There are no fixed points. Everything is constantly changing. And unless you understand that, then you're looking for like fixed and unchanging realities, then you're not going to understand the way that the world is and always has been. So, moving on. Yuan says the original maker of the Palestinian resistance in 60s through the mid-80s was mainly fedayeen from the peasant clans. Good point. Fear the people with nothing left to lose. Very good point from Banana Bender. DE says, I seem to remember some Israeli general commenting that the standard of troops in the IDF aren't what they used to be. This was an inquiry after the events of 2006 and the war they lost to Hezbollah. There was an internal inquiry which concluded that the quality of IDF troops just wasn't any good. It wasn't just a question of training. Their equipment's still very, very good. But it was a question of motivation, organization, and a lot of former Israeli officers point to a societal rot. You'll get the same argument from a lot of US reactionaries with regard to the US armed forces. Fundamentally, what they are a creation of their society. And if the society itself is going rotten and becoming more and more corroded due to the decay of capitalism, principally the decay of US imperialism, then the armed forces it produces are going to be more and more useless to reflect a more and more degenerated economic base and thus a more and more degenerated political and cultural sphere. Right, Martin says the Iranians are supplying blueprints for weapon systems that they have for Ansar Allah. That's a good point. The Iranians might be providing that kind of assistance on the design level, but it's being produced, as I said, locally. Philbin says other Arab and Middle East states are a big factor. I imagine in the timing of the Palestinian military operation, the absurd Abraham Accords had to be the final straw among PLO and expecting help. Yeah. Basically, this probably puts a big nail in the coffin of the whole Abraham Accords thing, which was always a bit of a dodgy prospect to start with. The return of the Palestinian masses into struggle against Israel makes normalization for even the Saudis to be an incredibly difficult prospect, and that'll be part of why it's been done. Also makes life for the Egyptian regime tremendously difficult, because this is a regime that is a creature of imperialism. It was brought into power by US and British imperialism in particular. Yes, they've applied to join the BRICS, but that doesn't change their overall alignment with the US. The overthrow of Morsi by General Sisi was principally a US endorsed operation, because even though the Muslim Brotherhood is politically garbage, they were talking about opening the border crossing with Gaza and ending the siege. That was enough for the US to pull the trigger on Morsi, possibly literally. So, Telltale39 says, what will it take for the Israeli regime to fall completely? Well, I'll recapitulate my position, the point I made earlier. For it to collapse completely would take the complete cutting off of economic, military, and political support from the US. That would cause it to implode. We've already seen a little bit of how it could happen, which is that everybody with a dual passport or dual citizenship leaves as soon as the shit hits the fan. So, like, you've got all these Americans running away and going back home. You have Bulgarians, Poles, Russians, people from the former Soviet states, all of whom went there in the 90s when they thought it was going to be party time, suddenly rediscovering their other nationality and running away again. That's not a stable basis for a society, by the way. It's not a stable basis for survival if huge numbers of your middle class population, your petty bourgeoisie, will literally pack up and fuck off as soon as a shot is fired. That doesn't say that this is a sustainable project. That says that this is an adventure for a while before they go home. So in the end, yeah, the cutoff of all aid, of all kinds of support from the United States, that would be one side of it. Their inability to control the Palestinian population, their inability to repress it for a sustained and long period of time, would cause the legitimacy of the Israeli state to crack and crumble, and their inability to use their nuclear weapons against an enemy which is too close to them, then you would see the legitimacy of the Israeli state start to crack and fall apart. Now, how they would react to that is an interesting question. I don't know. They may, if more sensible elements manage to seize control, realize that the game is up and that they'd better sign on to the kind of peace plans that are pushed by the Chinese and the Russians as a way of securing an exit for themselves from it. Perhaps this ends, I mean, this is complete speculation now. I don't want to be, this is off the top of my head stuff, but perhaps it ends if they can't subdue Palestinian resistance, either internal resistance against them by the Arab Israeli population, or external resistance from the Palestinians who are struggling against them right now. Then they may get to the point where they can't sustain things anymore. The Israeli shekel's taken a big hit today. I know I need to update myself on that. But if it became, if they were unable to defeat the insurgencies in and around them, then that would be another way of looking at it as well. Because there's only so much the US can do to support them. I mean, the US will be very unwilling to commit their own forces to engage in a direct and bloody suppression of a rebellion there. They'll give Israel weapons, they'll give Israel money, but I doubt they'd send their own men. Not openly, anyway. So yes, external cutoff or internal defeat in an insurgency that they can't quell. Those are the things that I think would cause the Israeli rulers to sign some sort of bargain to get themselves out of it, that would mark the end of this particular phase of Israel, and would it then probably cause Israel as a state to implode shortly afterwards. Right, well, Peter, I'm glad you liked the answers there. Philbin comes back with, hope Arab Middle Eastern states offer some support to the Palestinians. I think only Syria, Iran and Algeria remain militarily in favour of Palestinian liberation. The rest of the regional states have betrayed the PLO. Well, certainly you can't trust the Saudis and the Gulf states as far as you could chuck them. But even rulers like Mohammed bin Salman have to take into account that normalization with Israel is not particularly popular, even in Saudi Arabia itself. So he's got a motivation, if not to back the Palestinians, but to at least in verbal form back the two-state solution, which, as I said, would be deaf to political death to Israel anyway. So who knows how it's going to work out? We'll see. Roddy says, apparently Ireland just rejected EU suspension of aid to Palestine. Well, given that the Irish political class backs everything else the US does with regard to Palestine, that's a pretty meaningless thing. By the way, EU aid to Palestine isn't going to Gaza. I think it's going to the West Bank, and it's going to the PLA to essentially act as policeman for the imperialists. That's what that EU aid is for. That's why the EU won't be too bothered about getting it cut off, or not getting it cut off. Yuan says, meant parliamentary elections in the Gulf. Kuwait is considered to have the most democratic in the Middle East. EU parliament votes regularly to overthrow royal family cabinet ministers and PMs. Yeah, I think they did that to, as you said, basically engage in PR. I would suspect, though, that the British might regret making that decision now. It doesn't seem to make much difference, but I would say that in Kuwait there seems to be evidence of a strong pro-Palestinian sentiment. So I don't know. It would be interesting to see if that makes some kind of appearance in the Kuwaiti political system. 25 cents to the dollar apparently is the, or is that the strength of the shekel? Lowest point in a while. So yes, that's brings us to the top of the, we've been going for just over an hour, so I will leave it there for this evening. Obviously there's a lot of other things going on in the world, but we'll need probably another an hour on this tomorrow just to see where things have got to. I will at some point get to an analysis of Putin's Valdai Club speech. Not sure whether that'll be on a live stream or whether that'll be on an audio recording. I've yet to work that out, but I will get back to you tomorrow around about the same time. Irish Partisan, yes, I have seen your message. I will consider. I'll reach out to Ali Abunimah, see if I can get him on to speak about this. Be an interesting one to do. All right. I was going to go through the various positions of different communist parties, but I think with regard to Palestine, but I think that's going to have to be something we do tomorrow now, because I've got an early start in the morning. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in. Thank you to everybody who's contributed to the discussion. This is, of course, always better when we've got a more active chat. So thank you to everybody there. I will return again. It'll be another 8 o'clock show tomorrow because I've got a series of early starts. Thank you to, again, everybody who's tuned in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.